This is United States History to 1877, Chapter 7, The Early Republic. What you will learn in Chapter 7: 1. The Democratic Republicans represented the people as Federalists fell out of power. 2. Women, African Americans, and Native Americans were given a second-class status. 3. The nation expanded in size and in population. 4. The War of 1812 created a new patriotic identity. 5. The war reflected economic ambitions disguised as nationalism. 6. The U.S. lays claim to the entire Western Hemisphere. The success of the American Revolution and the establishment of a popular republic in North America inspired not only revolutions in France, but also in Haiti. When word of a slave uprising in the French colony of Haiti reached slaves in Virginia, it inspired Gabriel Prosser to lead a rebellion. Gabriel Prosser had planned to lead 1,000 men to end slavery in Virginia by attacking the city of Richmond. Their plan was discovered just before they could begin. They were caught, and Gabriel and 30 others were hanged. This effort, though, so scared whites that the Virginia government passed laws further limiting the movement of slaves. White Americans began to mock and insult African Americans as a way to reject calls for abolitionism and equal rights. The ridicule implied that whites felt threatened by the presence of African Americans in the political conversation, and their rejection only highlighted the sameness of whites and blacks, the opposite of the intended result. The Enlightenment had spread awareness of a common humanity, but growing awareness also came with observations about difference. Thinkers at the time argued there was a racial type determined by skin, hair, and the shape of the head. These were not real differences, but created by white fear and white supremacy. Nevertheless, the ideas were adopted, leading to arguments about white civilization being superior to African primitiveness. In Virginia, where Gabriel's rebellion so shocked the white elites, Thomas Jefferson argued African Americans were incapable of mental improvement and were not biologically the same as whites. This helped to justify slavery in the eyes of slave owners like Thomas Jefferson, and popularized the idea that whites and blacks could never live together as equals. African return was seen as a solution to the slavery issue. Thomas Jefferson had won the presidency in the election of 1800, a victory for common Americans to take greater control over government formed by and for the wealthy. The elite openly opposed government by the people, fearing they would lose their property to the masses. Jefferson wanted to prove otherwise, believing that a government that answered to the people would be a lasting national union. He wanted to prove that the people could govern themselves. Early American identity was strongly male, with women given few rights. Mercy Owen Wilson, who had argued strongly for the Constitution, was an important exception to this mailed version of American identity. After ratification, women were told their role was to raise children with strong values of independence and virtue. The idea of female participation in public life was defined by men as Republican motherhood. Women could serve their country by having many patriotic children. As the first Democratic Republican president, Thomas Jefferson worked to reduce taxes and the federal budget, but also doubled the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase was a deal with France that sent 15 million American dollars, or $250 million by today's money, to the French Emperor Napoleon for land held by hundreds of Native Americans who were never consulted and were paid nothing for their land. Because of the ongoing war in Europe between France and Great Britain, Thomas Jefferson sought neutrality, fearing war with either side. He closed down the economy to trade with the Embargo Act of 1807, angering American merchants everywhere. Smuggling increased, and some even called Thomas Jefferson a tyrant. Thomas Jefferson's sexual relationship with his slave, Sally Heming, was discussed publicly, and Jefferson was criticized as being not white because of it. While there are no known paintings of Sally Hemings, she played a large role in Thomas Jefferson's life, always traveling with him even when he served overseas. Hemings gave birth to multiple children by Thomas Jefferson. Of course, it was rape, because Hemings could not refuse Jefferson, being she was his slave. To Federalist critics, however, it was more outrageous because their relationship suggested racial equality between blacks and whites. Relations with Native Americans were another issue of tension, as whites continued to push west into Native American lands. Native American people were important trading partners, but were often condemned by whites as savages. White racism led Native Americans to seek greater separation. Soon, that separation would prove difficult, as Native Americans organized to protect their land from more and more encroachment by white settlers. Tecumseh, a Native American chief, traveled from Georgia to Canada to organize Native Americans into a pan-Indian confederacy seeking self-defense. During the War of 1812, Tecumseh sought to seize control of several American forts, fighting and losing the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. Soon after that, Tecumseh died in another battle, leaving a lasting legacy of the idea of a united Native American effort. Soon after Jefferson left office, the American government relaxed the embargo and soon got into conflict between France and England. Sailors on American ships had formerly been British sailors, but fled the war to work in America. Great Britain began seizing their sailors from American ships, an act known as impressment. Democratic Republican leaders called for war with England, and because they controlled Congress by large majorities, the war hawks, or members of Congress who wanted war, convinced President Madison to move for war with Great Britain. The Warhawks included important leaders like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. These Warhawks had forgotten the horrors of the American Revolution, and in 1812, the U.S. was again fighting the strongest nation on the globe. The war focused not on impressment, however, but on land in Canada. The desire for land and slaves lay at the root cause of the war. The Warhawks had used impressment as a disguise for their motivations. The U.S. was not successful, and efforts to invade Canada were largely failures. One victory of significance, however, came at New Orleans. Ironically, after the war was over, but before news of peace had reached the area. Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans and became a famous war hero who would soon launch a political career using his fame. During the war, Great Britain burned Washington, D.C. to the ground, even destroying parts of the new White House. Failures during the war led the Federalist Party to call a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. At the Hartford Convention, they called for an end to the war and a requirement for a 2/3 vote before declaring wars in the future. News of Jackson's victory led Americans to unite in patriotic bonds. During the war, Americans felt more patriotic. The war had given Americans more pride in their national efforts. Even the bombing of Fort McHenry in Baltimore led to the birth of the American national anthem. Americans read patriotic newspaper stories, sang patriotic songs, and bought items with national symbols. Because of this, newspapers accused the Federalists of plotting against the nation. This would prove to be the end of the Federalist Party, the party of Washington, and the first in the country's history. Politicians like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay tried to use these patriotic feelings to increase capitalism, proposing the government build roads, bridges, and canals. They called this plan the American System, connecting patriotism with government support for the economy, a form of socialism for the merchant class. The War of 1812 had reinforced America's sense of the importance of economic and political life. States supported road building and canals, even making state banks when the federal government did not act fast enough. The War of 1812 ended with a defeat for the United States and nothing gained. The influence of the war had strengthened American identity, launching the era of good feelings for the country. An example of the national pride was the declaration of the new President James Monroe that the U.S. considered the entire hemisphere to be American territory. Under the Monroe Doctrine, North and South America would be off limits to European colonization. The U.S. considered the area under its authority. The bold declaration by Monroe signaled the end of the early republic and the rise of an expanding American power, and the end of the Federalist Party. Without the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans would soon split, giving rise to Andrew Jackson and the new Whig Party. Inequality for race, gender, and class would continue to increase as the American economy experienced the first influences of the early Industrial Revolution. Soon, these inequalities would challenge the meaning of American democracy. What we learned in this lecture: 1. The Democratic Republicans represented the people as Federalists fell out of power. 2. Women, African Americans, and Native Americans were given a second-class status. 3. The nation expanded in size and population. 4. The War of 1812 created a new patriotic identity. 5. The war reflected economic ambitions disguised as nationalism. And 6. The U.S. lays claim to the entire Western Hemisphere. This has been United States History to 1877, Chapter 7, The Early Republic, created with work from the American Yawp, an open-source U.S. history textbook published by Stanford University and edited by Joseph Locke and Ben Wright. And it was narrated by myself, Tyler Rust, for History Dojo. For more information about history, go to historydojo.blog.